My daughter is a thief, and I can prove it. Those were the exact words my father said while standing at the head of the Thanksgiving table. 30 relatives were sitting around the room when he said it. Plates full of turkey and stuffing were in front of them, but suddenly nobody was eating anymore. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. My father slowly slid a white envelope across the table like he was delivering a final verdict. It stopped right in front of my plate. A court summons. My mother had already started crying, not quietly either, big dramatic tears running down her cheeks. She had always been good at that. I picked up the envelope and looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at my father, and instead of panicking, I smiled. Because 4 months earlier, I had hired someone whose job was to track money trails and financial fraud, and what that person discovered didn't just prove I was innocent, it exposed a lie my parents had been building for years, a lie that started the day my grandfather died. But before I explain everything, let me introduce myself. My name is Aaliyah. I'm 32 years old and I work as a registered nurse. I grew up in a small town in Georgia where everyone knows each other's business. The kind of town where gossip travels faster than the local news. 8 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, my grandfather Earl passed away. He was 84 years old. I drove 3 hours from my apartment to attend his funeral in Dawson, the small town where I grew up. Population about 4,000. My grandfather helped raise me when I was young. We spent summers fishing at the lake together. He taught me how to read while sitting on the porch of his old house. When I got accepted into nursing school, he mailed me a card with a $50 check and wrote in the memo line, "Proud of you, Ophi." But during the last 3 years of his life, something strange happened. He stopped responding to me. I called him dozens of times. Nothing. I mailed birthday cards, letters, photos from work. Still nothing. No reply. No returned mail. Just silence. I told myself maybe he was getting older, maybe he was confused or sick. I tried not to take it personally. Then the day of the funeral came. My father stood at the front of the chapel giving the eulogy. He looked emotional, his voice breaking at the perfect moments. My father was the greatest man I ever knew, he told the crowd. Everyone nodded and wiped away tears. I sat quietly in the 3rd row. No one invited me to sit closer. After the service, my father gathered the family in the church hallway. Then he made an announcement. "Dad left everything to me," he said. "The house, the savings, all of it." Most people simply accepted that, but something about the way he said it didn't feel right. It sounded rehearsed, too smooth, like he'd practiced that line. At the time, though, I pushed the thought aside because I had a much bigger problem already attached to my name, a problem that started 10 years earlier, when I was 22 years old and had just started my first nursing job. One Sunday evening, my father called and asked me to come over. When I arrived, he was sitting at the kitchen table with paperwork. My mother was beside him, already crying. "We just need your help for a little while," my father said. "The bank needs a co-signer for the mortgage. Just temporary, 6 months." So I signed. 6 months turned into a year, 1 year turned into 5, and eventually 10. Because every time I asked when my name would be removed from the mortgage, the answer was always the same. Things are tight right now. And my mother would start crying again. But what that signature actually cost me, I wouldn't understand until years later. And by the time I discovered the truth, it was already too late. Because the trap my father built around me was far worse than I ever imagined. And the first real crack in his story appeared the night I checked the mortgage account online. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop, a brand new withdrawal, $40,000, taken from the house using my name. And that's when I realized something terrifying. My father didn't just trap me in debt, he had used me to steal even more money. But I still didn't know the worst part yet, because a few weeks later, the rumors started spreading through town. And according to my parents, I wasn't just irresponsible, I was a thief. But the biggest mistake my father made wasn't stealing the money, it was mentioning one tiny detail about my grandfather's dresser drawer that he should never have known about. And that single detail is what led me to uncover the truth. The rumors didn't explode overnight. They started quietly. Whispers passed between relatives, casual conversations after church, small comments slipped into phone calls. According to my parents, I had been visiting my grandfather during his final months and taking money from him. At least, that was the story they were telling people. My father explained it like it was already common knowledge. She went over to Dad's house a few times near the end, he would say. After he passed, we noticed cash missing from his dresser drawer. Thousands of dollars supposedly gone. There was no proof, but in a small town like Dawson, proof isn't always necessary. Sometimes all it takes is one confident accusation from the right person, and my father had always been respected in town. The first time I heard about the rumor was from my cousin Travis. He called me one evening sounding hesitant. "Hey, Uncle Gerald said something strange," he told me. "What kind of strange?" I asked. "He said money disappeared from Grandpa's house. He thinks you took it." I felt my chest tighten. "That never happened," I said immediately. "I figured," Travis replied. "I just wanted to hear it from you." But the calls kept coming, relatives repeating the same story in different ways. Nobody directly accused me, they simply repeated what they had heard. Every time I defended myself, I sounded more defensive, and the more defensive I sounded, the more suspicious people became. A week later, the gossip reached my workplace. One of the nurses pulled me aside during a shift. "Everything okay at home?" she asked carefully. "Why?" "I heard something from my neighbor about your family and money issues." That was the moment it hit me. My father wasn't just protecting himself, he was preparing something. He was building a narrative where I was already the villain. If anyone ever questioned what happened to my grandfather's money, the entire town would already believe one thing, that I stole it. But my father made one mistake, one small detail that didn't make sense. During one conversation, he mentioned the missing cash came from my grandfather's dresser drawer. That detail stuck in my mind. How did he know about the dresser drawer? My grandfather had always kept a small stash of cash there, but only a few people even knew about it. I hadn't told anyone, so how did my father know? Unless he had been inside that drawer himself. The thought sat in my mind like a splinter, and once it was there, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So on my next day off, I drove to the county courthouse. I walked into the probate office and asked for the public records connected to my grandfather's estate. The clerk didn't ask many questions. Probate files are public. Anyone can request them. She printed the documents and handed me a thick folder. I sat down on a bench in the hallway and started reading. Inside was the will my father had submitted after my grandfather's death. It stated that everything, his house, his savings, all of his assets, had been left to my father. At first glance, it looked normal, but when I reached the signature page, I froze, because I had seen my grandfather's handwriting my entire life. Birthday cards, holiday checks, notes he used to leave me when I was younger. His handwriting had a specific rhythm to it. The letter E leaned slightly to the left, and his P had a long tail that dipped below the line. The signature on the will was close, very close, but it wasn't his. It looked like someone had tried very hard to copy it, too carefully, too perfectly. I took a photo of the document with my phone. Then I sat there thinking for a long time. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't even angry. I was certain, and that certainty led me to type 5 words into my phone's search bar: forensic accountant near me. because if my father forged that will, then somewhere, somehow, the money would tell the real story. And if I was right, the truth wouldn't just clear my name, it would destroy everything my father had been hiding. 4 months later, the forensic accountant handed me a report that traced every dollar of my grandfather's missing money, and when I saw where $350,000 had gone, I finally understood why my father was so desperate to make me the villain.
The dining room had gone completely quiet. 30 people sat around those long tables, plates half full, forks frozen in midair. Even the kids at the folding table in the corner had stopped whispering. Every pair of eyes in the room had shifted from my father to me. Gerald stood there confidently, arms folded across his chest like a prosecutor who had already won the case. "Our daughter stole money from my father," he repeated calmly, "and we finally have proof." My mother's crying filled the silence like background music. She dabbed her eyes with a napkin, shoulders shaking, exactly the way she always did when she wanted sympathy. The performance had begun. My father slowly walked around the table until he stood beside my chair. Then he slid a white envelope in front of me. "This," he announced loudly, "is a court summons." The words echoed across the room. "We are suing you for the return of my father's money." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another cousin leaned forward like they were watching a courtroom drama unfold live. I picked up the envelope slowly. From across the table, I could feel my father watching me closely, waiting for the reaction he expected. Shock, panic, tears, maybe even anger. Anything that would make me look guilty. Instead, I calmly opened the envelope and pulled out the paper inside. At first glance, it looked official, a county court header, my full name typed neatly under the defendant line, a signature at the bottom. But I had spent the past 4 months studying legal paperwork with a professional, and within seconds I noticed the problems. No case number, no clerk's filing stamp, the paper stock was wrong, even the font looked too clean, too perfect, like something printed from a home computer. It wasn't real, it was a prop. My father had staged this entire moment. I placed the paper gently back on the table beside my plate. Across from me, Uncle Danny leaned forward slightly. "Gerald," he said cautiously, "if you're filing something like this, you might want a good lawyer. I know someone who—" Gerald cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I've already handled it." But the room didn't look convinced anymore. People were studying the document from across the table, curiosity creeping into their expressions. My father crossed his arms again and looked at me expectantly. "Well?" he said. The entire room waited. This was the moment he had prepared for, the version of the story where I panicked, denied everything, and dug myself deeper into the hole he'd built for me. Instead, I folded my hands calmly on the table. Then I looked directly at him. "Before we go any further," I said, my voice steady, "I want to ask you one question." The room leaned in. My father lifted his chin slightly, still confident. "Did Grandpa Earl really write that will?" His eyes narrowed. "Of course he did," he snapped. "You're sure?" I asked quietly. His voice sharpened. "Are you calling me a liar in front of this entire family?" I didn't answer. Instead, I reached down beside my chair and pulled a large manila envelope from my bag. It landed on the table with a heavy thud. The sound seemed to echo through the room. Unlike the paper my father had just handed me, this envelope was thick, full, real. For the first time that night, I saw something flicker across Gerald Palmer's face. Not anger, not confidence, fear. I placed the envelope beside his fake summons and looked at him directly. "Funny," I said quietly. "I was about to ask you the same thing." And then I broke the seal. Inside were 4 months of evidence that were about to destroy the story he'd spent years building. But what the first document revealed would shock every single person at that table, and the next page would prove something even worse. When I broke the seal on the envelope, the entire table leaned forward, even my father. I pulled out the first document and held it up so everyone could see it. "This," I said calmly, is a signature comparison. A few confused glances moved around the room. I continued. It compares the signature on the will my dad submitted to the probate court with 17 verified signatures from my grandfather. Tax forms, bank paperwork, property records, documents that had been signed over decades, all authentic. I passed the page to Aunt Marlene, who was sitting closest to me. She adjusted her glasses and studied the paper. On the left side was the signature from the will Gerald filed after Grandpa died. On the right were the real ones, 17 of them. The difference was obvious once you looked closely. Grandpa's real handwriting had a rhythm to it, the same slanted letters, the long tail on the P in Palmer, the slight tremor that appeared in the later years, but still carried the same natural movement. But the signature on the will, it looked stiff, careful, like someone had slowly copied it while trying too hard not to make a mistake. Aunt Marlene's lips parted slightly. She looked up at my father, then quietly passed the page to Uncle Danny. A forensic accountant analyzed the signatures. Her professional conclusion is that the signature on the probate will was forged. That's ridiculous. Gerald's voice came out louder than he intended. Several relatives flinched. You paid someone to lie, he snapped. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for it, I replied evenly. I'm asking everyone to look. The paper moved slowly down the table. Person after person studied it, and as they did, the expressions around the room began to change. Confusion, then realization, then something harder. Uncle Danny held the page closer to the light and shook his head slowly. Travis stared at it for a long moment before sliding it to the next person, without looking at my father. Meanwhile, my mother had stopped crying, not because she felt better, because she was watching Gerald now, and there was fear in her eyes. I reached into the envelope again. This time I pulled out a single sheet of yellowed paper. The edges were creased, like it had been folded for years. My throat tightened slightly when I looked at it. This, I said quietly, is my grandfather's real will. The room froze. It was written in his own handwriting, witnessed by 2 neighbors, and dated 5 years before he passed away. I unfolded the paper and read the most important line out loud. I leave all real and personal property to be divided equally among my 4 grandchildren. I paused, then finished the sentence. Olelia, Nolan, Travis, and Megan. Not his son, his grandchildren. My father took a step backward. Where did you get that? He demanded. That's not legitimate. Before I could answer, a chair scraped loudly at the far end of the table. Everyone turned. Aunt Ruth slowly stood up. She was small, silver-haired, and had been so quiet most people had barely noticed she was there. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the entire room. Earl gave it to me. The room went still. 3 years before he died, she continued, your grandfather sat at my kitchen table and handed me that envelope. She looked directly at Gerald. And he told me something I never forgot. Her eyes shifted to me, then back to the room. He said, keep this safe, Ruth, because I don't trust my own son. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened that night. 30 people sat there, realizing the story they had believed was a lie. My father opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about winning. It was about the truth finally having a voice. But what happened after that dinner ended changed my family forever. And what my father tried to do next
was even worse. The courtroom was almost silent when the evidence was presented. Not the dramatic silence you see in movies, no gasps, no shouting, just a heavy stillness that settled over the room as the documents appeared one after another on the screen. The investigator I had hired months earlier sat calmly beside my lawyer. He had spent weeks tracing bank transfers, signatures, and timelines. Piece by piece, he had mapped out exactly what had happened after my grandfather passed away. And the story my parents had been telling for years, it didn't match the facts. The forged signature on the inheritance papers was the first crack in their version of events. A handwriting expert compared the documents side by side, highlighting tiny details most people would never notice: the pressure of the pen, the curve of certain letters, even the spacing between words. My grandfather's real signature looked steady and familiar. The one on the legal transfer document looked wrong. Then came the financial records. Money that should have been placed in a trust had been quietly moved into accounts controlled by my father. The timeline made it even clearer. The transfer started only days after my grandfather died. And the most important detail? None of it involved me. For years, my parents had built a story that painted me as irresponsible, greedy, and dishonest. They told relatives I had taken money meant for the family, that I had betrayed my grandfather's trust. But in that courtroom, every one of those claims collapsed. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. The inheritance documents were ruled invalid due to clear evidence of forgery. The assets connected to my grandfather's estate were ordered to be reviewed and redistributed according to his original will. My father didn't look at me once during the ruling. Not when the decision was read, not when the lawyers packed their papers, not even when the courtroom began to empty. For the first time in years, the weight I'd been carrying lifted off my shoulders. I hadn't just cleared my name. The truth had finally caught up with the lie. A few months later, life felt strangely quiet. My sister and I spent a weekend repainting her living room. Nothing dramatic, just music playing softly and the smell of fresh paint filling the air. For once, we didn't talk about the lawsuit, the accusations, or the years of tension. We didn't need to. Some things had already been said in court. Others didn't need words at all. After we finished, we sat on the floor with cold pizza and laughed about how uneven the paint lines were near the ceiling. It felt normal in a way our family life hadn't felt for a long time. A week after that, something unexpected arrived in the mail. It was from my Aunt Ruth. Inside the envelope was an old photograph I had never seen before. I was maybe 3 years old, sitting on my grandfather's lap at what looked like a summer picnic. He was laughing, his arm wrapped around me while I held a sparkler in both hands like it was the most important thing in the world. On the back of the photo, written in his careful handwriting, were a few simple words: "Ophi, Grandpa's proud of you." I stood in my kitchen for a long time holding that picture. Then I taped it to the refrigerator right next to my nursing license. For years, my father tried to reshape my grandfather's legacy, changing documents, twisting stories, and convincing everyone that his version of the past was the real one. But the truth has a strange way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. And sometimes, all it takes is one photograph, one investigation, and one moment of courage to bring it back into the light. But here's the question that still stays with me, because even after everything that happened, one part of this story still doesn't quite make sense. Why was my grandfather so certain something like this might happen in the first place? And what did he quietly put in place years before anyone else saw the warning signs?
For a while after the court case ended, I believed the story was finished. The inheritance had been corrected, the truth had come out, and the years of accusations had finally stopped. Life slowly started to feel normal again. I returned to work, my sister and I rebuilt our relationship, and the tension that had hung over our family for so long began to fade. But then something unexpected happened. About 3 months after the ruling, my lawyer called me. His voice sounded unusually curious. "Did your grandfather ever mention a second document?" he asked. I frowned. "What kind of document?" He replied, "A sealed letter."
Apparently, it was stored with the original will, but it wasn't meant to be opened unless there was a legal dispute over the inheritance. For a moment, I just stared at the phone. A sealed letter? No one had ever mentioned that before. 2 days later, my sister and I sat in the same law office where we had spent so many exhausting hours during the court battle, but this time the atmosphere felt completely different. No tension, no arguments, just quiet anticipation. Our lawyer carefully placed a small envelope on the table. The paper looked old, slightly yellowed at the edges. My grandfather's name was written across the front in the neat, steady handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and holiday letters. Below his name was a short note, "To be opened only if my wishes are questioned." My sister slowly covered her mouth with her hand. It suddenly became clear. My grandfather had expected this. Years before any of the conflict happened, he had already prepared for it. Our lawyer opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The room went silent as he began to read. "If you are reading this letter, it means there has been disagreement about my estate. I hope that is not the case, but I have lived long enough to know that money sometimes changes people in ways we never expect." My sister glanced at me, her eyes wide. The letter continued. "My granddaughter has always been honest, hardworking, and kind. If anyone ever claims she has acted dishonorably in regard to my will, I want it clearly understood that I do not believe that to be true." I felt a lump rise in my throat. For years, people had questioned my character. Some relatives believed the rumors, others stayed silent because they didn't know who to believe. But my grandfather had trusted me completely, even before the accusations started. The lawyer kept reading. "I have also left additional instructions with my attorney regarding the protection of my estate. If my wishes are ignored, those instructions will guide the court toward the truth." That explained everything. The handwriting analysis, the financial investigations, the detailed paper trail. My grandfather hadn't just written a will, he had built a safety net around it. He knew that if someone tried to manipulate his estate, the evidence would eventually expose it. And that's exactly what happened. When we left the office that day, my sister and I walked slowly to the parking lot. Neither of us spoke for a few minutes. Finally, she said quietly, "He knew." I nodded. "Yeah, I think he did." She looked up at the sky for a moment, then smiled. "And he still trusted you anyway." That sentence stayed with me. Because the truth was, my grandfather hadn't just left behind money or property, he left behind something far more important, proof of who he believed I really was. And when everything fell apart, that belief became the one thing that helped bring the truth back to the surface. Years later, the photograph from my aunt still sits on my refrigerator. My nursing license is still next to it, and every time I see my grandfather's handwriting on the back of that picture, I remember something important. Lies can spread quickly. They can divide families, destroy reputations, and linger for years. But the truth, when someone protects it carefully enough, has a way of waiting patiently, and eventually, it finds its way back into the light.
Looking back now, the entire situation feels like something that happened in another lifetime. For years, my life had been consumed by accusations, legal battles, and the painful realization that the people who were supposed to support me had turned against me. Every family gathering became tense. Every conversation with relatives felt like a quiet investigation. Some believed me, some didn't, and some simply stayed silent because they didn't want to get involved. At the time, it felt unbearable. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over again. Why would my own parents do this? Why was my grandfather's memory being used as part of a lie? And how long would it take before the truth finally came out? What I didn't realize then was that the truth had already been protected. My grandfather had quietly taken steps years before any of this began. His will was written carefully, his attorney had been instructed to keep additional records,
And that sealed letter, something none of us even knew existed, became the final confirmation of his intentions. He understood something many people don't realize until it's too late. Money can bring out sides of people that were always there, just hidden. But integrity eventually reveals itself too. When the investigation uncovered the forged signatures and hidden bank transfers, the legal victory was important. It cleared my name and restored the estate according to my grandfather's wishes. But the emotional impact was even bigger. For years, I had doubted myself, not because I believed the accusations, but because hearing them repeated over and over again starts to wear you down. You begin wondering how many people secretly believe the worst about you. The courtroom decision didn't just correct the paperwork, it restored something that had been slowly taken away, my reputation. And maybe even more importantly, it gave my sister and me the chance to rebuild our relationship without the weight of suspicion hanging between us. Today, our lives are quieter. We still talk about our grandfather sometimes. Usually it's small memories, his terrible jokes, the way he used to hum while working in the garage, or the long summer afternoons when he insisted everyone stay outside until sunset. Those memories feel different now. For a while, they were overshadowed by the conflict that followed his death. But once the truth surfaced, those memories became something they were always meant to be, a reminder of who he really was, and who he believed we could be. My parents and I rarely speak now. Time has created distance that may never fully close. Some wounds take longer to heal than others, and some relationships simply change forever. But strangely, I don't carry the anger I once felt, because in the end, the truth didn't just expose what went wrong. It showed something much more powerful, that one person's belief in you, especially someone who truly knows your character, can survive even the biggest storm of lies. My grandfather trusted me long before anyone else defended me. He prepared for a moment none of us wanted to imagine, and because of that preparation, the truth eventually stood on its own. So when I look at that photo on my refrigerator today, the one of a 3-year-old me sitting on his lap with a sparkler in my hands, I don't think about the court case anymore. I don't think about the accusations or the betrayal. Instead, I remember something much simpler. A grandfather who saw the kind of person I would grow up to be and made sure the world would see it too, no matter what happened.